In the small farming town of Clearwater, Montana, nobody suspected that Sarah Mitchell, the quiet mechanic who fixed tractors and pickup trucks, had once been one of the most feared fighter pilots in military history. They saw her calloused hands, her oil-stained overalls, and her preference for solitude, but they never imagined those same hands had once controlled million-dollar war machines capable of changing the course of battles. Sarah had spent 15 years hiding her past, building a simple life far from the roar of jet engines and the weight of classified missions. She told people she used to work on aircraft maintenance, which wasn't entirely a lie. She just never mentioned that she had also flown them into some of the most dangerous airspace on Earth. But secrets have a way of surfacing when you least expect them, and on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning, when 20 enemy aircraft appeared on radar screens heading straight for American soil, Sarah's carefully constructed peaceful life was about to shatter. The Pentagon had one desperate card left to play, and it had her name on it. What happens when a woman who has spent years running from her past must face her greatest fear to save the lives of millions? What price does a hero pay when duty calls them back from the shadows? And can someone who has hidden their true self for so long remember who they really are when everything depends on it? This is the story of how one woman's secret skills became the last line of defense between peace and catastrophe, and how sometimes the most unlikely heroes are hiding in plain sight, waiting for their moment to rise again. The morning sun cast long shadows across Mitchell's auto repair as Sarah wiped the grease from her hands with an old rag. The familiar smell of motor oil and metal filled the small garage where she had worked for the past 8 years. To everyone in Clearwater, Montana, she was just another mechanic trying to make an honest living in a town where farming and ranching were the main sources of income. Sarah looked up as the bell above the door chimed, announcing the arrival of Mrs. Henderson, whose ancient Ford pickup had been making strange noises for weeks. The elderly woman shuffled in, clutching her purse tightly, as she always did when discussing car repairs, worried about the cost. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson," Sarah called out, setting down her tools. "I've got good news about your truck. It was just a loose belt, nothing major. Should run smooth as silk now." Mrs. Henderson's face lit up with relief. "Oh, thank goodness. I was so worried it would be expensive. You're such a blessing to this community, Sarah. I don't know what we'd do without you." As Sarah processed the payment and handed over the keys, she felt the familiar tug of satisfaction that came from solving problems and helping people. It was a simple life, far removed from the complexity and danger of her previous career. She had chosen this peaceful existence deliberately, trading the adrenaline and prestige of her former life for something she valued more: anonymity and inner peace. After Mrs. Henderson left, Sarah returned to her current project, a stubborn transmission that had been giving her trouble all week. Her hands moved with practiced precision, each movement efficient and purposeful. What the townspeople didn't know was that these same hands had once operated some of the most sophisticated aircraft control systems ever built, navigating through enemy territory at speeds that would make most people sick with fear. Sarah had been born and raised in Phoenix, Arizona, the daughter of an Air Force colonel and a mathematics professor. From an early age, she had shown an unusual aptitude for spatial reasoning and mechanical systems. While other children played with dolls or video games, Sarah took apart radios and rebuilt them, fascinated by how complex systems work together to create something greater than the sum of their parts. Her father, Colonel James Mitchell, had initially been hesitant about his daughter's interest in military aviation. The early 2000s was still a time when female combat pilots faced significant challenges and skepticism, but Sarah's test scores and natural abilities were impossible to ignore. She excelled in every simulation, every training exercise, every challenge put before her. By the time she was 22, she was flying missions that most pilots wouldn't attempt until they had years more experience. The transition from promising cadet to elite fighter pilot hadn't been easy. Sarah faced doubts from fellow pilots, questions about her capabilities from commanding officers, and the constant pressure to prove herself in a male-dominated field. But she had something that couldn't be taught, an intuitive understanding of aerial combat that bordered on supernatural. She could read enemy movements before they happened, anticipate tactical decisions, and execute maneuvers that defied conventional wisdom. Her breakthrough came during a training exercise over the Nevada desert. Sarah was flying as part of a squadron, facing simulated enemy aircraft controlled by some of the military's best pilots. According to the exercise parameters, her team was outnumbered and outgunned, expected to provide tactical data before being shot down in the simulation. Instead, Sarah analyzed the enemy formation, identified weaknesses in their positioning, and executed a series of maneuvers that eliminated 3 simulated enemy aircraft before her teammates fully understood what was happening. The exercise controllers had to stop the simulation to verify that their equipment was functioning correctly. Sarah had done something that military strategists had considered impossible. She had turned a hopeless defensive position into a decisive victory through pure skill and tactical brilliance. Word of the exercise spread quickly through military circles. Within months, Sarah found herself assigned to increasingly sensitive missions, her security clearance elevated to levels that most officers never reached. She flew reconnaissance missions over hostile territory, provided air support for special operations teams, and participated in classified operations that would never appear in any public record. The work was dangerous and demanding, but Sarah thrived in the high-pressure environment. She developed a reputation for completing missions that other pilots considered suicide runs, always bringing her aircraft home safely, often with intelligence that proved crucial to larger strategic operations. Her call sign, Ghost, reflected both her ability to appear and disappear from enemy radar and her tendency to avoid social interactions with fellow pilots. But success in military aviation came with a price that Sarah hadn't fully understood when she first put on her flight suit. Every mission carried the weight of potential consequences, not just for her own safety but for the lives of people on the ground, the success of broader military operations, and sometimes the direction of international conflicts. The decisions she made in split seconds while traveling at supersonic speeds could affect the lives of thousands of people she would never meet. The psychological pressure began to accumulate over the years. Sarah found herself lying awake at night, replaying missions in her mind, questioning decisions she had made, wondering about the long-term consequences of actions she had taken in the heat of combat. She began to isolate herself from other pilots, spending her off-duty time alone, maintaining her aircraft, or studying technical manuals. Her commanding officers noticed the changes, but attributed them to the natural evolution of an elite pilot dealing with classified operations. They provided access to military psychologists and stress management programs, but Sarah found these resources inadequate for dealing with the unique pressures of her situation. How could she explain to a counselor that she sometimes woke up in cold sweats, not from fear of death, but from the weight of responsibility for decisions that affected national security? The breaking point came during a mission over Eastern Europe in 2011. Sarah was providing air support for a covert operation to extract intelligence assets from a hostile region. The mission required precision flying through mountainous terrain while avoiding both enemy radar and civilian populations. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Weather conditions deteriorated, enemy forces appeared in unexpected locations, and communication systems began failing. Sarah found herself making life-and-death decisions with incomplete information, forced to choose between mission success and the safety of both her own team and innocent civilians below. She managed to complete the extraction successfully, but not without consequences that would haunt her for years to come. The official record listed the mission as a complete success, but Sarah knew the true cost in ways that couldn't be measured in official reports. In the months following that mission, Sarah began to question everything about her career and her life. She had joined the military to serve her country and protect innocent people, but the reality of modern warfare was far more complex than the clear-cut scenarios she had imagined as a young cadet. The line between hero and participant in morally ambiguous operations had become blurred beyond recognition. Sarah began researching options for leaving active duty while maintaining her security clearances and obligations. The process was complicated, involving extensive debriefings, psychological evaluations, and agreements about disclosure of classified information. Military officials were reluctant to lose one of their most capable pilots, but they also recognized that forcing someone to continue in such a role against their will could create security risks and operational problems. The transition out of military service took nearly 2 years. Sarah had to undergo counseling sessions, sign numerous legal documents, and gradually reduce her involvement in classified operations. She used this time to develop skills that would allow her to build a civilian life, studying automotive repair, small business management, and the practical skills needed for life outside the military hierarchy. When Sarah finally received her honorable discharge in 2013, she felt both relief and a profound sense of loss. She was leaving behind not just a career, but an entire identity. She had spent over a decade as one of the military's most elite pilots, and now she needed to discover who she was without that role defining her existence. Sarah chose Clearwater, Montana, specifically because it was the opposite of everything she had known in the military. The town was small enough that everyone knew each other, peaceful enough that the most serious crime in recent memory was teenagers spray painting the water tower, and remote enough that her past was unlikely to follow her there. She bought the auto repair shop from an elderly mechanic who was ready to retire, using savings she had accumulated during her military service. The early years in Clearwater were challenging in ways Sarah hadn't expected. She was accustomed to operating sophisticated equipment and making decisions that affected major operations, but now she spent her days replacing brake pads and changing oil. The work was honest and necessary, but it felt almost mundane compared to the intensity of her former life. More difficult was learning to interact with people as a civilian. In the military, relationships were defined by rank, mission requirements, and professional obligations. In Clearwater, people wanted to be friends, to know about her background, to include her in community activities. Sarah struggled with the balance between maintaining the secrecy her former career required and building the genuine human connections she had missed during years of isolation. She gradually developed a cover story that was technically true but omitted crucial details. She told people she had worked in aircraft maintenance for the Air Force, had decided she wanted a quieter life, and had always been interested in mechanical work. Most people accepted this explanation without question, impressed that someone with military experience had chosen to settle in their small town. Over time, Sarah began to find satisfaction in her new life. She took pride in keeping the community's vehicles running, in being someone people could depend on for honest service and fair prices. She bought a small house on the edge of town, adopted a dog from the local shelter, and slowly began to participate in community activities like the annual Harvest Festival and volunteer fire department fundraisers. But even as she built this new identity, Sarah never completely escaped the pull of her former life. She found herself watching news reports about international conflicts with professional interest, analyzing military operations from the perspective of someone who understood the complexities invisible to civilian observers. She maintained her physical fitness at levels far beyond what was necessary for her current work, running 10-mile routes through the Montana countryside, and maintaining reflexes that most people her age had long since lost. Sarah also kept certain skills sharp through private practice. She had built a flight simulator in her basement, ostensibly for entertainment, but actually to maintain her piloting abilities. She told herself it was just a hobby, but deep down she knew she was maintaining capabilities that she might never need again, but couldn't bring herself to abandon completely. On quiet evenings, Sarah sometimes sat on her porch and watched aircraft passing overhead, commercial flights following established routes to distant cities. She could identify aircraft types by sound, estimate their speed and altitude, and sometimes found herself planning intercept routes or defensive maneuvers out of pure habit. These moments reminded her that despite 8 years of civilian life, the pilot she had been was still part of who she was, dormant but not dead. The people of Clearwater saw Sarah as a reliable mechanic, a quiet neighbor, and a valued member of their community. They had no idea that the woman who fixed their cars and donated her time to community projects had once been capable of single-handedly changing the outcome of military operations. Sarah preferred it that way, believing that her past was exactly that. Past. But as Sarah would soon discover, some skills are too important to remain hidden forever, and sometimes the world has a way of calling upon its hidden heroes when they are needed most. The peaceful life she had built in Clearwater was about to be tested in ways she never could have imagined, and the secret she had guarded so carefully for 8 years was about to become the key to preventing a catastrophe that could change the course of history. The helicopter arrived exactly on schedule, its rotor wash scattering dust and loose papers across the parking lot of Mitchell's Auto Repair. Sarah watched through her office window as 2 military personnel in flight suits stepped out of the aircraft, their movements crisp and purposeful. She recognized the type immediately. Career military officers accustomed to high-pressure situations and urgent timelines. Sarah grabbed her hastily packed bag and walked out to meet them. The senior officer, a major by his insignia, extended his hand as she approached. "Major Harrison, ma'am, this is Captain Torres. We're here to transport you to Malmstrom for the briefing and mission preparation." Sarah shook both their hands, noting the professional but slightly curious expressions on their faces. She wondered what they had been told about her background, how much they knew about why a small-town mechanic was being summoned for a critical military mission. "How long is the flight to Malmstrom?" Sarah asked, as they walked toward the helicopter. 45 minutes, ma'am. We've got updated briefing materials on board, and you'll be connected to the command center during flight for real-time intelligence updates. As the helicopter lifted off, Sarah looked down at Clearwater growing smaller below them. The town looked peaceful and ordinary from the air, a small collection of buildings surrounded by farmland and forests. It was hard to believe that somewhere hundreds of miles away, 20 unidentified aircraft were approaching American airspace with unknown intentions. During the flight, Major Harrison handed Sarah a tablet loaded with classified briefing materials. The first document was a comprehensive intelligence summary that made her stomach tighten with concern. The unidentified aircraft had maintained their formation and heading with mechanical precision, ignoring all attempts at radio communication from both military and civilian air traffic control. More troubling was the analysis of their flight characteristics. The aircraft were exhibiting performance capabilities consistent with advanced military fighters, maintaining speeds and altitudes that suggested sophisticated technology and professional piloting. Most concerning was their route, a direct approach towards major West Coast cities that showed either remarkable navigation precision or detailed knowledge of American geography. Sarah studied radar tracking data that showed the aircraft's movements over the past several hours. Their formation was textbook military, tight enough to provide mutual support, spread enough to avoid presenting a concentrated target, with clear evidence of disciplined flight procedures. These were not amateur pilots or civilian aircraft that had strayed off course. The intelligence briefing also included analysis of global military activities that might explain the presence of these aircraft. Every major military power had been contacted through diplomatic channels, and all had denied having aircraft in the area. Allied nations had provided verification of their military flight schedules, and none showed operations that could account for 20 fighters approaching American airspace.
Major, Sarah said, looking up from the briefing materials, has anyone considered the possibility that these might be American aircraft on some kind of classified mission? Major Harrison exchanged a glance with Captain Torres before responding.
That was one of the first things we checked, ma'am.
Every black project, every classified operation, every special access program. We've accounted for all American military aircraft. These unknowns are not ours.
The certainty in his voice was both reassuring and terrifying.
If these aircraft were not American, and no Allied nation claimed them, then their presence represented either a massive intelligence failure or a deliberate act of aggression by an unknown enemy.
Sarah continued reading through the briefing materials, focusing on the tactical situation she would face. The F-22 Raptor waiting for her at Malmstrom was a formidable aircraft, arguably the most advanced fighter in the world. Its stealth capabilities, sophisticated radar systems, and advanced weapons would give her significant advantages against most potential adversaries. But engaging 20 enemy aircraft, even with superior technology, would require tactics and decision-making that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. Sarah began mentally rehearsing scenarios, considering approach angles, weapon employment strategies, and contingency plans for various enemy responses. The helicopter began its descent toward Malmstrom Air Force Base, and Sarah could see the distinctive outline of military hangars and runways below.
The base was bustling with activity despite the early hour, with personnel and vehicles moving with the urgent efficiency that characterized military operations during crisis situations.
As they touched down, Sarah was met by Colonel Rodriguez himself, the officer who had made the initial phone call.
He was younger than she had expected, probably in his early 40s, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions under pressure. Mitchell, thank you for coming. I know this isn't what you planned for your Tuesday morning. Colonel, let's focus on the mission. What's the current status of the unknown aircraft? Still maintaining course and speed, now approximately 3 hours from reaching major population centers. We've got the F-22 prepared and ready, and our best technicians have been working to ensure all systems are optimal for combat operations. They walked quickly toward the hangar where Sarah would receive her final briefing and preparation. The base was a hub of controlled activity, with personnel moving between buildings, vehicles transporting equipment, and the constant background noise of aircraft engines and radio communications. In the briefing room, Sarah was introduced to a team of intelligence analysts, tactical specialists, and technical experts who had been assembled to support the mission. The room contained multiple screens showing real-time radar data, satellite imagery, and communication intercepts related to the unknown aircraft. The lead intelligence analyst, a sharp-eyed captain named Williams, began the detailed tactical briefing. "Man, based on current tracking data, the unknown aircraft will enter defensive identification zones in approximately 2 hours and 45 minutes. Their current formation suggests they're preparing for either reconnaissance operations or coordinated attacks on multiple targets." Sarah studied the projected flight paths displayed on the main screen. The enemy aircraft were approaching from the northwest, following routes that would bring them over Seattle, Portland, and Northern California. If they maintained their current heading and speed, they would be in position to attack major population centers or critical infrastructure within hours. Captain Williams, what's our assessment of their likely capabilities? Are we looking at air-to-air fighters, ground attack aircraft, or multi-role platforms? Based on their flight characteristics and formation patterns, Our analysts believe these are multi-role fighters capable of both air-to-air combat and ground attack missions. The fact that they're approaching major population centers suggests they might be configured for ground attack, but we have to assume they're also capable of engaging intercepting aircraft. The tactical implications were sobering. Sarah would be facing 20 aircraft that were potentially configured for multiple mission types, flown by pilots with unknown training and capabilities, using technology that was completely unidentified. It would be like flying blind into a situation where any assumptions about enemy capabilities could prove fatal. The technical briefing on the F-22 systems was both reassuring and overwhelming. The aircraft had been upgraded with the latest electronic warfare systems, advanced radar capabilities, and weapons that gave it significant advantages over most potential adversaries. But Sarah hadn't flown an F-22 in 8 years, and the systems had evolved considerably during that time. Major Thompson will be your technical advisor during the mission, Colonel Rodriguez explained, introducing a young officer with the confident demeanor of someone who understood complex aircraft systems intimately. He'll be in direct radio contact throughout your flight, able to provide real-time technical support and tactical advice. Sarah appreciated the support, but she also knew that in aerial combat, split-second decisions often couldn't wait for consultation with ground-based advisors. She would need to rely on her training, experience, and instincts developed over years of flying in dangerous situations. The weapons briefing was comprehensive and sobering. The F-22 was loaded with a full complement of air-to-air missiles, including long-range AIM-120 EMRAM and short-range AIM. 9 Sidewinders. She would also carry a full load of 20 mm cannon ammunition for close-range engagements. The weapons gave her significant firepower, but against 20 enemy aircraft, ammunition management would be critical. Mitchell, Colonel Rodriguez said as the briefing concluded, I need to be clear about the rules of engagement. You are authorized to engage these aircraft if they demonstrate hostile intent, continue approaching populated areas after being warned, or take any action that suggests imminent attack on civilian targets. Sarah understood the weight of those words. She was being given authority to make decisions that could result in the destruction of aircraft and the deaths of their pilots. If she was wrong about enemy intentions, if these aircraft were somehow friendly forces on misunderstood missions, the consequences would be catastrophic for both international relations and her own conscience.
Colonel, what constitutes demonstration of hostile intent?
Are we talking about weapons lock-on, aggressive maneuvering, or simply continuing to approach populated areas? Any of those, Mitchell? The key factor is protection of civilian populations. If these aircraft pose a credible threat to American cities, you are authorized to eliminate that threat. As Sarah was escorted to the hangar where the F-22 waited, she felt the familiar pre-mission mixture of anticipation and anxiety that had characterized her military flying career. The aircraft stood under bright lights, its angular stealth design both beautiful and menacing. Maintenance crews were performing final checks, their movements precise and professional. Sarah spent 30 minutes familiarizing herself with the specific systems and configurations of this particular aircraft. While F-22s were standardized, each individual aircraft had subtle differences in how systems were calibrated, how controls responded, and how various components performed. These differences could be critical in combat situations where precise aircraft control meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The flight suit felt both familiar and strange after 8 years of civilian clothes. The helmet, oxygen mask, and survival equipment brought back memories of countless training flights and combat missions. But this time was different. This time she was returning to military aviation not as a career decision, but as a response to a crisis that could affect millions of American lives. As maintenance crews completed their final checks and began preparing the aircraft for departure, Sarah received one last intelligence update. The unknown aircraft had maintained their formation and heading, showing no response to repeated radio calls from air traffic control. They were now less than 3 hours from reaching major population centers. Mitchell, Colonel Rodriguez said as she prepared to climb into the cockpit, I want you to know that we have complete confidence in your abilities. You're the right person for this mission. Sarah nodded, then paused before climbing the ladder to the cockpit. Colonel, what happens if these aircraft are somehow friendly, if there's been some kind of massive misunderstanding? Then we'll deal with the diplomatic consequences later. Right now, our priority is protecting American lives. If these aircraft are friendly, they need to identify themselves immediately and change their heading away from populated areas. If they don't, we have to assume hostile intent. Sarah climbed into the cockpit and began the startup procedures that she had performed hundreds of times during her military career. The aircraft came alive around her, systems initializing, computers running diagnostic checks, and weapon systems preparing for potential combat. Despite 8 years away from military flying, her hands moved with practiced efficiency through the complex startup sequence. As the F-22's engine spooled up to full power, Sarah felt the familiar transformation that occurred whenever she took control of a high-performance military aircraft. She was no longer a small-town mechanic who had been pulled reluctantly back into service. She was Ghost, elite fighter pilot, preparing to face a threat that could change the course of American history. The tower cleared her for immediate takeoff, and Sarah taxied the F-22 toward the active runway. In a few minutes, she would be airborne, climbing toward an intercept with 20 unidentified aircraft, whose intentions could range from reconnaissance to devastating attack. It was the kind of mission she had hoped never to fly again. But as the aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted into the Montana sky, Sarah felt the sharp focus and deadly competence that had made her one of the military's most feared pilots. The peaceful life she had built in Clearwater was now hundreds of miles behind her, and ahead lay a confrontation that would test every skill she had developed during her years as a combat pilot. 20 enemy aircraft were approaching American soil, and she was the only thing standing between them and the civilian populations they might be targeting. As Sarah turned the F-22 toward the intercept coordinates, she began the mental preparation that preceded every combat mission, analyzing intelligence data, rehearsing tactical scenarios, and accepting the possibility that the next few hours could end with either triumph or catastrophe. The stakes had never been higher, and failure was not an option she could afford to consider. At 35,000 feet, climbing through thin clouds toward the intercept coordinates, Sarah felt the familiar sensation of her world narrowing to the confines of the F-22's cockpit. The aircraft responded to her commands with the precision she remembered, every system functioning with the reliability that made American military technology legendary. But beneath her professional calm, Sarah was acutely aware that she was flying toward a confrontation that could determine the fate of millions of people. The radio crackled with updates from the command center. Ghost, this is Control. Unknown aircraft are maintaining course and speed. Now 2 hours 15 minutes from reaching populated areas. We're showing 20 contacts in formation. Altitude 35,000 feet, bearing 280 degrees from your current position. Sarah adjusted her heading and began climbing to intercept altitude. The F-22's advanced radar systems were already painting a picture of the airspace ahead, but the unknown aircraft was still beyond detection range. In a few minutes, she would have her first electronic contact with whatever was approaching American airspace. Control, Ghost. What's the latest intelligence on aircraft identification? Any new information from diplomatic channels? We've exhausted all official channels. No nation claims these aircraft, and no military organization acknowledges having forces in this area. You are authorized to proceed with intercept and identification procedures. She was flying towards 20 aircraft of completely unknown origin, with no information about their capabilities, intentions, or the skill level of their pilots. In military aviation, unknown variables were often the most dangerous factors in any engagement. The F-22's radar system suddenly illuminated multiple contacts ahead, appearing on her display as 20 distinct aircraft flying in tight formation. Sarah's training took over immediately, analyzing the tactical picture and beginning to formulate approach strategies. The enemy aircraft were flying in 4 diamond formations of 5 aircraft each, maintaining precise spacing and altitude control that indicated professional military training. Control, Ghost. I have radar contact with 20 aircraft, confirmed formation flying, bearing 275 degrees at range 180 miles. Formation discipline appears professional military standard. Requesting permission to begin approach and identification procedures. Ghost. Control. You are cleared to approach and attempt identification. Maintain combat readiness and be prepared to engage if aircraft demonstrate hostile intent or fail to respond to identification requests. Sarah began her approach, using the F-22's stealth capabilities to close distance while remaining undetected by enemy radar systems. The advanced aircraft allowed her to observe the unknown formations while maintaining the element of surprise, a critical advantage when facing overwhelming numerical odds. As she closed to within 200 miles, Sarah began attempting radio contact on all standard frequencies. Unknown aircraft approaching U.S. airspace, this is United States Air Force. Identify yourselves immediately and state your intentions. Silence. The radio channels remained empty except for the background static of long-range communications. Sarah repeated the call on emergency frequencies, military channels, and international aviation frequencies. Still no response. At 80 miles range, Sarah could see the unknown aircraft clearly on her radar displays. They were maintaining perfect formation discipline, showing no signs of detecting her approach despite her proximity. The aircraft appeared to be single-seat fighters, similar in size and performance characteristics to American F-16s or F-18s, but with some design elements that didn't match any aircraft in her extensive mental database. Control, Ghost. Unknown aircraft are not responding to radio calls on any frequency. They appear to be single-seat fighters of unknown design, maintaining military formation discipline. No indication they've detected my approach. Ghost, Control. Continue approach and make visual identification if possible. Rules of engagement remain in effect. You are authorized to engage if aircraft demonstrate hostile intent or continue toward populated areas. Sarah continued closing distance, now at 60 miles from the unknown formation. She was using every sensor available to gather intelligence about these aircraft: radar signatures, infrared emissions, electronic warfare indicators, and visual observation systems. The more information she could gather, the better her chances of making correct tactical decisions in the moments ahead. At 50 miles, something changed. The lead aircraft in the first formation suddenly broke radio silence. American fighter, we detect your approach. Maintain distance and do not interfere with our mission. The voice was heavily accented, but the English was clear and professional. More importantly, the transmission confirmed that these aircraft were aware of her presence and were capable of detecting even the F-22's stealth capabilities. This suggested technology and training levels that were more advanced than intelligence estimates had indicated. Sarah keyed her radio immediately. Unknown aircraft, this is United States Air Force. You are approaching U.S. airspace without authorization. Identify yourselves immediately and state your intentions, or you will be considered hostile. The response came from the same lead aircraft, but this time with an edge of menace that made Sarah's blood run cold. American pilot, our mission does not concern you. Withdraw immediately or face the consequences. Control, Ghost. Unknown aircraft have made contact and are refusing to identify themselves. They are ordering me to withdraw and threatening consequences if I interfere with their mission, requesting guidance on rules of engagement. The response from the command center was immediate and unambiguous. Ghost, Control. Aircraft approaching populated areas without identification and making threats against U.S. military forces constitute hostile intent. You are authorized to engage. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded combat engagements. She was now facing 20 enemy aircraft that had refused identification, threatened U.S. military forces, and were continuing to approach major population centers. Under any reasonable interpretation of rules of engagement, they had demonstrated hostile intent. But engaging 20 aircraft simultaneously was beyond what any single pilot had ever attempted. Sarah needed tactics that would maximize her advantages while minimizing her exposure to enemy weapons. The F-22's stealth capabilities, advanced missiles, and superior radar systems would be crucial, but success would ultimately depend on tactical decisions made in split-second timing. Sarah began positioning for her first engagement, using the F-22's beyond visual range missile capabilities to engage the enemy formation while remaining outside their effective weapons envelope. She targeted the lead aircraft in each of the four formations, hoping to disrupt their coordination and command structure with the opening salvo. Control, Ghost. Beginning engagement. Targeting formation leaders with AIM-120 missiles. Sarah triggered 4 long-range missiles in rapid sequence, each targeted at a different formation leader. The missiles streaked away from her aircraft at supersonic speed, their advanced guidance systems locked onto specific enemy aircraft. She immediately began maneuvering to avoid potential return fire while preparing for follow-up engagements. The enemy response was swift and professional. All 4 formations immediately broke apart and began evasive maneuvers, launching electronic countermeasures and deploying defensive systems. 3 of Sarah's missiles found their targets, destroying formation leaders in brilliant explosions that lit up the sky. The 4th missile was successfully decoyed by enemy countermeasures. Control, Ghost. 3 confirmed kills. Enemy aircraft are dispersing and beginning evasive maneuvers. They're showing sophisticated defensive capabilities. The remaining 17 enemy aircraft were no longer flying in neat formations. They had spread across a wide area of airspace and were beginning to converge on Sarah's position from multiple directions. This was the most dangerous phase of the engagement. Close-range aerial combat against overwhelming numbers. Sarah used the F-22's superior speed and maneuverability to avoid the initial enemy attack, diving and climbing through 3-dimensional space, while launching short-range missiles at targets of opportunity. 2 more enemy aircraft fell to her AIM-9 Sidewinders, but the remaining 15 were now fully engaged in combat and demonstrating flying skills that matched her own. The engagement became a deadly dance of supersonic aircraft maneuvering through space at speeds that compressed decision-making into milliseconds. Sarah found herself pulling G-forces that pushed her physical endurance to its limits while simultaneously operating weapons systems, monitoring radar displays, and maintaining awareness of multiple enemy aircraft attempting to gain firing positions. One enemy aircraft managed to achieve a missile lock and fired at close range. Sarah deployed countermeasures and executed a violent evasive maneuver that broke the missile guidance. But the near miss reminded her that even the slightest mistake could be fatal when facing so many adversaries. Using the F-22's cannon, Sarah engaged 2 more enemy aircraft at close range, her precise shooting destroying both in spectacular fashion. But ammunition was becoming a critical concern. She had used most of her missiles and was running low on cannon rounds, while 12 enemy aircraft remained in the fight. Control Ghost. 7 confirmed kills, but I'm running low on ammunition. 12 enemy aircraft remaining, and they're demonstrating advanced combat capabilities. Ghost Control. Reinforcements are en route, but won't arrive for 30 minutes. You need to prevent these aircraft from reaching populated areas by any means necessary. Sarah understood the implications. She was being told to continue fighting even if it meant sacrificing her own aircraft to prevent enemy aircraft from reaching civilian targets. It was the kind of decision that every military pilot understood might be required, but hoped never to face. The remaining enemy aircraft seemed to understand her ammunition situation and began pressing their attacks more aggressively. Sarah found herself constantly on the defensive, using every trick she had learned during years of combat training to avoid enemy missiles and cannon fire, while looking for opportunities to eliminate additional threats. In a moment of tactical inspiration, Sarah remembered a maneuver she had developed during training exercises years earlier. She positioned herself between the enemy aircraft and a mountain range, then used the F-22's superior climbing ability to force the enemy into a position where they would silhouette themselves against the sky while she remained hidden against the mountain backdrop. The tactic worked perfectly. Sarah was able to eliminate 3 more enemy aircraft with her remaining cannon ammunition before the survivors realized what was happening. But 9 aircraft remained, and Sarah was now effectively out of ammunition except for her final AIM-9 missile. The enemy aircraft regrouped and began a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm Sarah's defensive capabilities. She found herself flying the F-22 at its absolute performance limits, pulling maneuvers that stressed both the aircraft and her body beyond normal operational parameters. The G-forces were so intense that her vision began to grey at the edges, but she maintained control and continued fighting. In a desperate gambit, Sarah used her last missile to destroy the apparent leader of the remaining enemy aircraft, hoping to disrupt their coordination. The missile found its target, but the remaining 8 aircraft continued their attack with undiminished intensity. Sarah was now fighting 8 enemy aircraft with no missiles and no cannon ammunition. All she had left were her wits, her flying skills, and the superior performance characteristics of the F-22. It was a situation that would have been considered hopeless by most military standards, but Sarah had always specialized in impossible situations. She began using the F-22 itself as a weapon, executing high-speed passes that forced enemy aircraft into defensive maneuvers, using her superior radar to anticipate enemy movements, and exploiting every advantage offered by American technology. In one particularly audacious maneuver, she caused 2 enemy aircraft to collide while attempting to intercept her. The remaining enemy pilots seemed to realize they were facing a pilot of extraordinary skill. They began flying more cautiously, attempting to use their numerical advantage to wear down Sarah's aircraft and force her into a position where they could overwhelm her defenses. But Sarah was fighting for more than just military objectives. She was fighting for the civilians in Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco, who had no idea that their lives hung in the balance of this aerial battle. She was fighting to prove that the skills she had tried to abandon in Clearwater were still sharp enough to make the difference between safety and catastrophe for millions of Americans. As the battle continued at supersonic speeds above the clouds, Sarah began to realize that conventional tactics were not going to be sufficient to eliminate the remaining enemy aircraft. She was going to need to take risks that went beyond normal operational parameters, to push both herself and her aircraft beyond established safety limits. The final phase of the engagement was about to begin, and Sarah knew that the next few minutes would determine not only her own survival, but the safety of every civilian in the major cities that the enemy aircraft was still trying to reach. With 8 enemy aircraft remaining and no ammunition left,
She was going to have to win this fight with pure flying skill and tactical brilliance. The peaceful life in Clearwater had never seemed more distant than it did at this moment, 35,000 feet above the earth, locked in mortal combat with enemies whose identities remained unknown, but whose intentions were unmistakably hostile. Sarah had become Ghost once again, and the final test of her abilities was just beginning. With 8 enemy aircraft still pursuing their mission toward populated areas and her weapons exhausted, Sarah found herself in a situation that transcended conventional military tactics. She was going to have to win this engagement using nothing but the superior performance of her F-22 and flying skills that had been honed through years of training and combat experience. The remaining enemy pilots had adapted their tactics, spreading out across a wider area of airspace to prevent Sarah from using her previous maneuvers against them. They were flying in loose pairs, attempting to coordinate attacks that would force her into positions where she couldn't escape or counterattack effectively. Sarah analyzed the tactical situation with the clarity that extreme stress often brought to experienced combat pilots. The enemy aircraft were still heading generally toward populated areas, but their engagement with her had forced them to deviate from their original course and consume fuel in combat maneuvering. This gave her a potential advantage. If she could delay them long enough, some might be forced to withdraw due to fuel limitations. But time was also working against her. The F-22 consumed fuel rapidly during high-intensity combat, and Sarah's own fuel situation was becoming critical. She had perhaps 20 minutes of combat fuel remaining before she would need to consider emergency landing options. The radio crackled with an update from the command center. Ghost Control. Reinforcements are 15 minutes out, but we need you to prevent enemy aircraft from reaching populated areas. Seattle is beginning civilian evacuations based on current projections. The news that civilian evacuations were underway made Sarah's mission even more urgent. Panic in major cities could cause casualties even if the enemy aircraft never reached their targets. Every minute she could delay or eliminate enemy aircraft was potentially saving lives on the ground. Sarah made a tactical decision that went against conventional military doctrine. Instead of continuing to fight defensively, she was going to take the offensive against 8 aircraft while having no weapons. Her plan was audacious to the point of being considered suicidal by normal standards, but Sarah had never been bound by normal standards. She identified the 2 enemy aircraft that appeared to be maintaining the most direct course towards Seattle and began a high-speed intercept that would bring her into extremely close proximity to both aircraft. Her intention was to use the F-22's superior maneuverability to force both enemy aircraft into defensive maneuvers that would disrupt their mission progress. The enemy pilots detected her approach and began evasive maneuvers, but Sarah had anticipated their responses. She used the F-22's advanced flight control systems to execute maneuvers that kept her position between the enemy aircraft and their intended flight path toward populated areas. What followed was an aerial ballet performed at supersonic speeds, with 3 aircraft maneuvering through 3-dimensional space in ways that pushed the boundaries of what both machines and human pilots could endure. Sarah found herself pulling G-forces that exceeded the F-22's normal operational limits, her vision periodically graying out from the physical stress. But the tactic was working. The 2 enemy aircraft were being forced to maneuver defensively rather than maintaining their course toward populated areas. More importantly, their fuel consumption during these maneuvers was rapidly approaching critical levels for long-range missions. One of the enemy pilots apparently reached his fuel emergency threshold and broke off from the engagement, turning away from populated areas and heading toward what Sarah assumed was either a refueling point or recovery area. The second pilot continued maneuvering with Sarah, but his aircraft was beginning to show signs of fuel stress in its flight characteristics. Sarah pressed her advantage, continuing to force the remaining aircraft into defensive maneuvers, while simultaneously monitoring the positions of the other 6 enemy aircraft. She was essentially playing a 3-dimensional chess game at supersonic speeds, using her single aircraft to control the movements of multiple enemy formations. The second aircraft in her immediate engagement suddenly experienced what appeared to be fuel starvation, its engine flaming out at high altitude. The pilot ejected successfully, but his aircraft tumbled toward the Earth in a death spiral. Sarah felt a moment of professional sympathy for the enemy pilot, understanding the helplessness of aircraft emergency situations, regardless of which side someone fought for. 6 enemy aircraft remained, but they'd been scattered across a wide area of airspace and forced to consume significant fuel in combat maneuvering. Sarah began systematically engaging each pair of aircraft, using the same tactics that had proven successful against the first 2. Her second engagement was against 2 aircraft that had been attempting to circle around her position to continue their approach to Portland. Sarah intercepted them at maximum speed, forcing both into violent evasive maneuvers that brought them dangerously close to each other. In a moment of exceptional flying skill,
Sarah positioned her aircraft in such a way that one enemy pilot, attempting to avoid collision with her, inadvertently collided with his wingman. Both aircraft exploded in a fireball that briefly lit up the sky like a second sun.
Sarah flew through the debris field, her F-22's advanced systems protecting her from damage. 4 enemy aircraft remained, but they were now widely scattered and showing signs of fuel stress.
Sarah could see on her tactical display that reinforcements were finally approaching from the south. 2 additional F-22s that would arrive within minutes to assist with the remaining threats. But Sarah wasn't finished. She had identified what appeared to be the senior enemy pilot, flying an aircraft that had been providing tactical coordination to the remaining formations. If she could eliminate this aircraft, the remaining enemy pilots might lose the coordination necessary to continue their mission effectively.
Sarah began her most dangerous maneuver yet, a high-speed intercept against an aircraft whose pilot appeared to have skill levels comparable to her own. The engagement that followed was a masterpiece of aerial combat, with both aircraft maneuvering at the absolute limits of their performance capabilities. The enemy pilot was good, possibly as skilled as any American military pilot Sarah had encountered. But he was flying an aircraft that, while advanced, lacked some of the technological advantages of the F-22.
More importantly, he was operating far from his home base with limited fuel and no support, while Sarah was fighting to protect her homeland. The engagement lasted less than 5 minutes but felt like hours.
Both aircraft pulled maneuvers that should have been impossible, executing turns and climbs that pushed both machines and pilots beyond normal operational parameters. Sarah found herself flying entirely on instinct, her conscious mind unable to process the speed of decisions required for this level of aerial combat. The decisive moment came when the enemy pilot attempted a vertical climb to gain altitude advantage over Sarah's F-22. Sarah recognized the maneuver and responded with a climbing spiral that brought her aircraft into a position directly behind the enemy fighter.
Without weapons, she couldn't shoot, but she could use her aircraft's superior power-to-weight ratio to maintain the advantage position. What happened next would be debated by military aviation experts for years afterward. Sarah used her F-22's exhaust to create turbulence that disrupted the airflow over the enemy aircraft's wings and control surfaces. The technique, known informally as jet washing, was extremely dangerous for both aircraft, but could be devastatingly effective when executed with precision.
The enemy aircraft lost control and entered an unrecoverable flat spin. Sarah watched as the pilot ejected safely, his aircraft tumbling toward the earth while his parachute deployed successfully.
She felt no satisfaction in the victory, only professional respect for a skilled opponent who had fought well under impossible circumstances. 3 enemy aircraft remained, but they were now facing not only Sarah, but also the 2 reinforcement F-22s that had finally arrived on the scene. The remaining enemy pilots apparently realized their situation was hopeless and began withdrawing toward the northwest, abandoning their mission and heading away from populated areas.
Control, Ghost. Remaining enemy aircraft are withdrawing from the area. Mission appears to be terminated. Requesting permission to escort withdrawal to ensure they don't change course back toward populated areas. Ghost, Control.
Excellent work. Maintain observation on withdrawing aircraft and escort them to the edge of identification zone. We'll take over tracking from there. Sarah felt the exhaustion that follows intense combat beginning to set in as her adrenaline levels started to normalize.
She had been flying at maximum intensity for over an hour, pushing both herself and her aircraft beyond normal limits. But the mission had been successful. 20 enemy aircraft had been prevented from reaching American population centers. As Sarah escorted the remaining enemy aircraft away from populated areas, she began processing what had just occurred. She had engaged 20 enemy fighters single-handedly, destroying or disabling 17 of them, while preventing all of them from completing their apparent mission. It was a level of combat success that would have been considered impossible by most military analysts.
But more importantly, millions of American civilians were safe. Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco were no longer under threat from unknown aircraft with hostile intentions. Whatever those aircraft had been planning, whether reconnaissance, attack, or demonstration, had been prevented by Sarah's intervention. The flight back to Malmstrom gave Sarah time to reflect on what this mission meant for her carefully constructed civilian life.
She had spent 8 years trying to escape the responsibilities and pressures of military aviation, building a simple existence where her biggest worry was replacing brake pads and fixing transmissions. But the mission had reminded her of something she had tried to forget. She was exceptionally good at military aviation, possibly one of the most skilled combat pilots of her generation. The skills she had hidden in Clearwater were not just personal attributes.
They were national resources that could be called upon when the country faced genuine threats. As Malmstrom Air Force Base appeared on the horizon, Sarah began the mental transition from combat pilot back to civilian mechanic. But she knew that transition would be more difficult this time. She had been reminded of who she was when the stakes were highest, and that knowledge would be difficult to suppress again. The landing and post-mission debriefing were handled with the professional efficiency that characterized military operations. Sarah provided detailed reports on enemy aircraft capabilities, tactics, and apparent objectives. Intelligence analysts would spend weeks analyzing every aspect of the engagement, trying to determine who the enemy pilots had been and what their mission objectives were. Colonel Rodriguez met her as she climbed down from the F-22's cockpit. "Mitchell, what you did today was extraordinary. We've never had a single pilot engage 20 enemy aircraft successfully. You've probably saved more American lives than we can calculate." Sarah felt the weight of that statement, but also the complexity of her situation. She had proven that her skills remained sharp after 8 years of civilian life, but she had also demonstrated that she couldn't completely escape the responsibilities that came with those skills. "Colonel, what happens now? Are these aircraft likely to return? Do we know who they were or what they wanted?" "That's above my security clearance, Mitchell. But I can tell you that your actions today have given our intelligence analysts crucial information about potential threats to American airspace. Whatever these aircraft were, whoever sent them, they now know that we have capabilities they didn't expect." The helicopter ride back to Clearwater gave Sarah time to consider how this experience would affect her life going forward. She had successfully protected American civilians from a serious threat, but she had also revealed that her attempt to live as a normal civilian was more complicated than she had hoped. As Clearwater appeared below the helicopter, looking exactly as peaceful and ordinary as it had when she left that morning, Sarah realized that her secret was safe. The townspeople would never know that their quiet mechanic had just prevented a potential catastrophe that could have affected millions of people. But Sarah would know. She would know that when her country needed her most, when conventional military resources weren't available, she had been able to make the difference between safety and disaster for countless American families. The helicopter landed in the same parking lot where it had picked her up earlier that day. Sarah gathered her belongings and walked back toward her auto repair shop, where Tom Bradley's Chevy still waited under the lift, its exhaust system half repaired. As Sarah changed back into her work clothes and picked up her tools, she felt the familiar comfort of returning to simple, straightforward, mechanical problems. But she also felt something new. The satisfaction of knowing that her hidden skills had been used for the most important mission of her life. The phone in her office rang as she resumed work on the exhaust system. Sarah looked at the caller ID and saw Mrs. Henderson's number. "Mitchell's Auto Repair," she answered, her voice steady and professional. "Sarah, dear, I just wanted to thank you again for fixing my truck so reasonably. You're such a blessing to this community. Hensiare." Sarah smiled as she responded. "Just doing my job, Mrs. Henderson. That's what I'm here for." As she hung up the phone, Sarah realized that Mrs. J. Henderson was more correct than she could possibly know. Sarah was indeed there to serve her community, but her community was larger than the small town of Clearwater. Her community included every American who slept safely because people with her skills stood ready to protect them when needed. Sarah Mitchell would continue working as a mechanic in Clearwater, Montana, fixing trucks and helping her neighbors with their automotive problems. But she would do so with the knowledge that when her country faced its greatest need, she had proven herself worthy of the trust placed in her years earlier when she first put on a military uniform. The secret she had kept for 8 years remained safe, but it had been transformed. No longer was it a burden she carried from a life she wanted to forget. Now, it was a source of quiet pride in knowing that she had used her unique abilities to protect the lives of people she would never meet, in a battle that would never be publicly acknowledged. Sarah returned to work under Tom Bradley's Chevy, her hands steady and her mind clear. She was a small-town mechanic, and she was also one of the most skilled combat pilots in American military history. Both identities were true, both were important, and both were part of who she had chosen to become. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Mitchell's Auto Repair, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air above ordinary tools and everyday automotive problems. It was a peaceful scene in a peaceful town, made possible by people who were willing to step forward when peace was threatened. Sarah had kept her skills secret for 8 years, but when 20 enemy jets faced her firepower, those hidden abilities had made all the difference between catastrophe and safety for millions of American civilians. Sometimes the most important battles are fought by people whose names will never be known, whose actions will never be publicly acknowledged, but whose courage makes all the difference when the stakes are highest. In Clearwater, Montana, life continued as it always had, with one important difference. the quiet mechanic who fixed everyone's trucks had proven herself to be exactly the kind of person America could count on when counting mattered most.